Last time we talked about the Spanish-American War of 1898 and how it led to the freeing of Cuba, though the United States did keep troops on the island for several years after the war ended. But also it led to the American annexation of Puerto Rico in the Caribbean and to the island of Guam in the Marianas Islands in the Pacific. America's most spectacular victory of the war took place in the Philippine Islands, and the annexation of the Philippines led to an intense debate not only over the fate of the Philippines themselves, but over American imperialism in general. Many Americans believe that acquiring the Philippines would be great for America's economic interests in Asia and also for missionary activities in China and elsewhere. But there were plenty of Americans who were opposed to the idea of Philippine annexation. Among the leading anti-imperialists were Mark Twain, Jane Addams, and Andrew Carnegie. In fact, Carnegie was so opposed to American annexation of the Philippines that at one point he suggested that perhaps he should buy the Philippines for himself and then he could set them free. At any rate, the debate over Philippine annexation was caught up in the 1900 presidential election, which was a rematch between William McKinley, the incumbent president, and Democratic challenger William Jennings Bryan. Bryan was a strong anti-imperialist, but he urged his fellow Democrats in the Senate to vote to ratify the peace treaty, even though that would mean that the United States would acquire control of the Philippines. But Bryan intended the election of 1900 to be a popular referendum on imperialism, and he was convinced that the public would then reject McKinley and his imperialist administration. The United States would then grant the Philippines their independence. Unfortunately for Bryan, the American people did not reject McKinley in 1900, but rather re-elected him by a landslide, and so the Philippines remained in American possession until after World War II. So to the extent that the election of 1900 was a referendum on imperialism, a majority of the voters showed that they supported imperialism. In annexing the Philippines, the United States also annexed a war. When the Filipinos realized that they were merely exchanging one colonial ruler for another, they rose in revolt against the Americans. The Philippine insurrection, as it was sometimes called, lasted much longer than the Spanish-American War itself, involved far more American troops than the Spanish-American War itself, and led to more American casualties than the Spanish-American War itself. And the nature of the fighting even led the Americans to employ methods similar to the reconcentration policy used by the Spanish in Cuba. So the Americans found out at an early date that if you're going to be an imperial power, it may have many benefits, but it also can lead to a lot of headaches. William McKinley made the United States a great power, but in September of 1901, just a few months into his second term, he was assassinated. This brought to the presidency Theodore Roosevelt, who had won notoriety partly as a result of his participation in the Spanish-American War. Many credit Roosevelt with creating the modern American presidency. We've already talked a little bit about his domestic policy. In terms of foreign policy, Roosevelt was obsessed with getting a canal built through Central America. Ever since the United States acquired control of California in 1848, there had been interest in trying to dig a canal through Central America to drastically reduce the transportation time and expense from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But it had proved to be impossible given the physical environment, among other things. The Spanish-American War had reinforced the desire to build a canal through Central America because at the beginning of the war, the American battleship Oregon, which was in port in Seattle, Washington, had been ordered to sail to Cuba to assist with the American invasion of the island, but it took 2 months for the Oregon to make the voyage all the way around South America. Roosevelt was determined to get the canal built, and he took advantage of the fact that Panama, which was then controlled by the nation of Colombia, was undergoing a revolution. Roosevelt did not start the Panamanian independence movement, but he did take advantage of it by sending American warships to the coast of Panama to prevent the Colombian government from sending troops to put down the insurrection. Then, once Panama was recognized as an independent nation, one of the first things that it did was to sign a treaty with the United States, selling a zone 10 miles wide right through the middle of the isthmus in which to construct the canal. Roosevelt later boasted, "I am interested in the Panama Canal because I started it. If I had followed traditional conservative methods, I would have submitted a dignified state paper of probably 200 pages to Congress, and the debates on it would be going on yet. But I took the canal zone and let Congress debate, and while the debate goes on, the canal does also." By the time the Panama Canal was completed in 1914, Roosevelt had left office, but the Panama Canal does stand as probably his greatest achievement in foreign policy, even though the methods he used to bring it about did lead to a lot of resentment against the United States in Latin America, and of course, most especially in Colombia. Roosevelt was basically a realist when it came to foreign policy. He knew when he could use force and when he needed to resort to diplomacy. So he did not hesitate to throw America's weight around in the Western Hemisphere. On the other side of the globe, in Asia, however, Roosevelt realized that diplomacy was probably going to be more effective, and so he did conclude a series of agreements with Japan. Japan was a country that was also a rising power in the world, along with the United States, and Roosevelt wanted to make sure that the Japanese understood that the United States had interests in the Western Pacific and in Asia as well. Before he left office in 1907, Roosevelt decided to send the U.S. battle fleet on a round-the-world cruise, which was designed to impress other nations, especially Japan, with America's growing strength. There was some opposition to this, partly on financial grounds. Some congressmen questioned if it was worth the expense of sending the Navy on a round-the-world cruise. Roosevelt's response was he had enough money to send the Navy halfway around the world. If they wanted them to come home, they needed to appropriate the rest of the money. There was also a concern about what might happen if trouble broke out close to home while the fleet was on the other side of the globe. But at any rate, the cruise of the Great White Fleet, as it was known, because the ships were painted gleaming white, was sort of Roosevelt's final flourish in foreign policy. One of the countries, again, that he was most interested in impressing was Japan. There was some concern as to how the Great White Fleet would be received in Japan, but the Japanese received it warmly, and the cruise continued. However, in many respects, the main impact of the cruise of the Great White Fleet on Japan was to encourage the Japanese to begin increasing the size of their own navy. Roosevelt's successor in the White House, William Howard Taft, pursued a foreign policy that came to be known as dollar diplomacy. And basically, Taft thought that what was good for American business was good for America. And the theory was that American economic penetration would bring not only power and profit to the United States, but would also help bring stability to underdeveloped nations. The idea was basically that enough dollars invested would make guns unnecessary, but this didn't always work out. In 1912, as we talked about, Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic progressive, defeated Taft and Roosevelt for the presidency. Wilson was mainly interested in domestic reform, but when it comes to his foreign policy, Wilson was often referred to as the missionary diplomatist. Wilson was a very devout Calvinist Presbyterian who wanted to spread the gospel of American democracy, and he was assisted in his efforts by his first Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan. Wilson and Bryan renounced dollar diplomacy and sought to conduct American foreign policy on a high moral plane. This idealistic approach was occasionally successful, but where America's most vital interests were concerned, Wilson and Bryan sometimes failed to live up to their professed high standards. So Wilson, like Roosevelt and Taft before him, ended up sending American troops to occupy Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. Wilson also faced a number of challenges in Mexico. But by far, the greatest challenge to Wilson when it came to foreign policy was World War I, which broke out in the summer of 1914. The United States declared its neutrality, but in a war like the Great War, it was going to be very difficult for the United States to maintain its neutral status and still continue to carry on trade with the powers that were at war. In 1916, Wilson ran for a second term, By that point, World War I had been raging for over 2 years and had already claimed hundreds of thousands or millions of lives. The United States was divided. Most Americans wanted to stay out of the conflict. Wilson did, and he ran under the slogan of "He kept us out of war" in 1916. However, Germany's determination to choke off the flow of supplies from the United States to her enemies, Britain and France, led to an increasing conflict, particularly since Germany relied heavily on the use of submarines to prevent the United States from trading with her enemies. There were several incidents in the submarine war that pushed the United States and Germany closer to war, the most famous or infamous being the sinking of the Lusitania in May of 1915. However, it was not until after Wilson's re-election in November of 1916 that the German High Command decided to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. And this would lead to a series of incidents that would eventually push the United States into the conflict in April of 1917.